quite cloak. I've got 15 minutes of tape left is all I got.
I thought I'd fine-tune a couple things. We talked about upper tension and going up maybe a little bit tighter as it comes up, but I really don't bother most of the time because I think that usually it comes up and it comes right back down most of the time. So you use something in Newport and all of a sudden the wind changes back the other way again. The lowers, Peter said to try to get the mast roughly straight in the boat, and that's important at the dock. But what I actually look for in light air, or light to moderate air, is I actually side up the mast when I'm on a tack. And so if I'm on port tack, I look up this side and I look up at the groove, and I actually like to see it deflect to leeward a little bit. And so the mast is actually bending a little bit to the leeward side, maybe 2 inches.
In the middle.
In the middle.
About a half
and what would that, just since we're talking about all these principal things, what would that do to the headstay sag? Just after thinking about a bow and arrow. If you use a very stiff bow and arrow, you're going to be able to shoot an arrow. You're going to be able to shoot the arrow farther.
That lets the spreaders do a little more work to tighten the headstay.
Yeah. So what it actually, if the mast is actually bending anytime, whether it's fore and aft, you saw the effect of the backstay on the tension of the lowers. When he tightened the backstay, the tension on our uppers went way down. So we were taught by Peter that make sure the backstay is off when you set these upper tension. Well, the leeward tension, if the mast is actually deflecting a little bit to leeward, your mast is bending, it's compressing into the boat, which means it's not a very stiff member, so therefore the headstay sags a little bit more. Okay? So in heavy air, we'd like to see the mast sit straight in the boat, so side to side. So if you sided up the mast in heavy air, or pretty windy conditions, what you'd like to see is that thing not deflect to leeward, because then you're transferring whatever tension you want into your headstay to keep it from sagging too much. So let's talk about headstay sag and review that just a little bit more again. Anytime the headstay is sagging this way into the leech, it's doing what to the shape of the sail? Making it fuller. And so we talked about power, but we didn't talk about drag. So the America's Cup, the trimarans or catamarans sailed around, and did you notice the jib had, when they just sailed around after the race, the jib had a big wrinkle from here down to the clew. And that was because they were just cruising around and the headstay was tight. Once they got going 30 knots or something, there is so much load on that headstay on that catamaran, it was deflecting, and the power of the jib came into the right shape by the deflection of the headstay. So it did sag a little bit. They couldn't keep control of it forever. So it did sag and it came into that right shape. But that sail was so flat and so starred for lufter, and people shape these sails in different ways, but it had all the shape out of it sitting at the dock. And then it came into shape under load, under headstay sag. So thinking about that on Harbor20, if we're sailing in heavy air, we want to make the mast straighter, and we'd want to crank the backstay a little bit and keep the headstay from sagging too much, because that's going to transfer into more drag. If the sail's going to be too full, we're not going to point as high, and we're going to go sideways. So those are the things to think about. But so those are just some of the things I think about when I sail and set the outhaul tension in particular. What happens in 5 knots of breeze with the wind velocity at the surface and the wind velocity at the top of the sail versus 10 knots of breeze with the wind velocity at the surface and the wind velocity at the top of the sail is different. And I think in 5 knots of breeze, you've got maybe 5 knots at the top and 1 knot at the bottom. In 10 knots, you got 10 knots at the top, maybe 8 knots at the bottom. So the twist is totally different. So if you set this outhaul and forget it all day long, and you're crewing for somebody, or your crew doesn't know how to look up at the twist of that sail, you can go around leeward mark and think that, hey, I got set just the way I had last time, but the wind's 5 knots less. Where should we set that outhaul? Looser or tighter? Looser. So we let the outhaul out, let the glue ride up, and let the sail twist to where it should be, so that the sail is still open and drawing. And the wind comes up and freshens up, and the boom bends up, and the outhaul stretches. We tighten the outhaul down so we can get the whole sail working. Otherwise, the top of the sail is going to be luffing, and the bottom of the sail is going to be working, and we're not really going to be getting all the power we need out of the jib. Gary, you have a question?
Once it gets windy, not only is the mast flexing sideways, but particularly when you crank on the backstay, it flexes fore and aft. Is there any way that you can pull it back a little bit straighter fore and aft to avoid headstay sagging?
You bet.
Can you repeat the question?
So his question was, in heavier, let's say we're tightening the backstay, and we're trying to get the most tension on the headstay for, I mean, Harbor20 is, we only sail at 12 knots of breeze, but let's say it was 20 knots or something. What would you want to do? You'd probably want to tighten these lowers, and that would have the effect of making this mast stiffer. And that would also have the effect of transferring whatever tension you're putting in the backstay directly into the headstay. So if this is just going to absorb and you're going to have soft lower tensions, and you tighten the backstay, the mast is just a sponge, and it really doesn't transfer that much load to the headstay to help make much of a difference. But if you tighten these at the same time, it would. But all this stuff is a little theoretical, because the truth of the matter is we sail in 8 knots or 6 knots most of the time, and we don't really change things very often. And if we did sail in more variety, we'd probably change the rig more than we do. So in reality, I don't really change things very often from one race to the next. Bill?
Yeah, you adjust your jib outhaul based on the luff. I mean, what I normally was told to do was to get the boat going, luff it up slowly, and see where it breaks. And if it breaks too high, I guess you've got to loosen the outhaul. If it breaks too low, reverse. Is that right?
No, if it breaks too high,
Maybe I got it backwards.
yeah, backwards. If it breaks too high, you want to tighten the outhaul and close that openness up top. And if you come around the leeward mark, some of us like to sail downwind with the outhaul tight on the jib, because we're utilizing more of the jib downwind. And you go around the leeward mark and you forget to let that outhaul out, and all of a sudden that jib is a big air brake going around the mark. So you've got the jib too tight.
Really? But you want some twist up there or not?
You want a little bit of twist, but you want twist so that all the telltales are working roughly together.
Okay.
I do have an observation about the geometry of this particular setup, which is applicable to the conditions we usually sail in. One day I took a tape measure and I ran it up my jib sock line, and I measured to the top of my jib boom with the boom in the middle of the boat. Then I put it out at 90 degrees and I made the same measurement. It's 4 inches shorter, because the boom is not straight up in the boat, it's angled, so it goes out, it goes up. So when your boom is out for broad reaching, you've lost 4 inches of leach tension. You'll see often in the lighter air that boats that have just basically set up their boat so their clue is down at the end of their boom, sailing upwind. You let the thing all the way out, there's 4 inches less tension, and if you look at the top third of that sail, it's pointed straight forward. It's not 90 degrees to the wind. Okay? It's not a big thing, but it is better. So my observation on that, and what I do, is that in this type of wind, I set up for close haul with 4 inches of outhaul sticking out the end of the boom. Then, as I round the leeward mark, I pull that 4 inches out. The other thing it does is if I have 4 inches sticking out there, and the wind increases by 5 or 10 knots, I've still got that able to pull in, and I don't have to go forward and move the sail up.
So, great observation. Let's talk about one other thing on jib height that Peter was talking about. What happens with, I put a mark on my headstay and a mark on my halyard here so I roughly know where it is. Because if I don't have any mark and I adjust it, I have really no idea how much I adjusted it by the time I finish tying that knot. But you guys are all getting higher tech, and you're going to have these adjustable halyards as well, so that's great. But this mark has helped me kind of go to kind of a base neutral where I kind of know where it is. But if I raise the jib up more in the foil, what's it going to do to the shape of the sail when I'm sailing along? Ultimately, if it's, you know, we're talking about the same wind condition, 8 knots going upwind. I raise the sail up 3 inches. What's that going to do to the shape of the sail?
Tighter leach.
Deeper. It makes it deeper, right. And if I lower the sail, it has the effect of allowing it to twist more and it flattens it more. So it makes the sail a little flatter. So if you feel like you're sailing around and you're not getting up to speed quick enough, or you're basically underpowered, you can just raise the sail up by half an inch and it might make a difference for you. And if, on the other hand, if your boom is too high, and the reason the boats that we had a few years ago, Jim spent a lot of time coming up with the Kerrigan to lengthen people's booms so they could actually pull the jib all the way in. But what happened in heavy air when you couldn't get your sail sheeted all the way up top, and you had a relatively high boom, you were forced to pull the jib up in the foil to get the sail to work. And then what happened? You got too full of sail. So yeah, in the air brake, whether you wanted to or not. So that's the importance of getting everybody to get their jib booms at a relatively low number. Mine's probably a little higher than it should be, frankly. And I'd like to get maybe somebody to help me wrap it around a tree and lower it.
I'd like to make just a note on this. Bill noted that if you move the sail up, it gets deeper. What I'd like to do is help you understand, well, why is that? Because that makes it easier to understand it than just remembering that that's what happens. If this end, if I pull back on this, it gets flatter, right?
Yes.
This makes it deeper.
Yes.
Okay? Well, the headstay is angled, right? So if I go to the lower part here to this fixed part down here, and I lower it, it's moving more towards the bow and stretching it more. If I raise it, it's moving more away from the bow and deepening it more. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
So, how do you determine how much depth you want in that
I
sail?
think kind of just experience and getting out there and sailing the boat and try to sail against another boat and figure out if you're accelerating when you think you should or pointing as you should. If you're not pointing, maybe your jib's too full.
Do you use the leech telltales at all?
No. I mean, I don't really look at it. I look at the leading telltales all the time. I put more on there than they supply you with, so you have a good idea what's going on the well. But I kind of look at that. I look at the leech more on what I think it should look in. It should have a profile that comes out and roughly stays, open from top to bottom, as opposed to just too tight at the top and then open at the bottom. That would be your outhaul's too tight. Or on the other hand, if it's too open at the top and it's luffing and tight at the bottom, your outhaul is too loose. Right? Does that make sense? So it's just kind of trial and error and going out and sailing and figuring out where it should be and putting a mark on it to start with and changing that. Like I think after the first day of racing in the championship this year, I thought we were a little slow accelerating. And I actually raised my jib up about a half an inch or something, and I felt better the second day. I felt like we were accelerating better. The other thing I thought is, all this stuff is pretty easy. We get our numbers right, we get our jib boom the right height, we start to adjust the outhaul more than we probably have in the past, as far as getting our crews to look at it.